They tell you the Atlantic was a wall, an uncrossable barrier, a hard stop between worlds. Africa on one side, the Americas on the other. No contact until Europeans discovered something already full of people. That story sounds clean, simple, comforting. It's also wrong. Because long before Columbus ever got lost with a map, African plants were already growing in the Americas. Not accidentally, not mysteriously, but deliberately. Cultivated, integrated, normalized. And once you follow the plants, the entire timeline collapses. Here's why plants matter more than ships, bones, or myths. Plants don't travel themselves across oceans and then magically embed into farming systems. They don't naturalize overnight. They require knowledge of soil, seasons, propagation, storage, and purpose. You don't just find a foreign plant thriving in a new continent. Someone brings it. Someone knows what it's for. Someone teaches others how to grow it. That's the opposite problem. Because when archaeologists catalog ancient American agriculture, they quietly acknowledge something that never makes it into textbooks. Multiple crops in pre-Columbian America are African in origin, not similar, not lookalikes, genetically and botanically African. Let's start with the one they hate discussing the most. Cotton. Yes, cotton existed in the Americas before Europeans. That part they admit. What they don't emphasize is that Old World African cotton species appear alongside New World varieties with cultivation techniques that match African methods, not Eurasian ones. Different species, same processing logic, same spinning technologies, same agricultural rhythms. That's not coincidence, that's transfer. Then there's sorghum, a drought-resistant grain domesticated in Africa thousands of years ago. Sorghum pollen and residue show up in archaeological layers in the Americas before European contact. Not widespread at first, experimental, localized. Exactly how you'd expect from a newly introduced crop. Then comes bottle gourd, one of the most damning cases. For decades, historians claim bottle gourds floated across oceans on their own, just drifted, landed, grew, civilized themselves. That explanation collapsed once genetic testing showed that pre-Columbian American bottle gourds match African lineages, not Asian ones. Let that sink in. Not Asian, African. Floating seeds don't explain selective domestication. They don't explain why the gourds appear already integrated into tool-making, storage systems, musical instruments, and ritual use. The same roles they held in Africa. That's cultural continuity, not accident. And then there's okra. Officially, okra arrives with Europeans. Unofficially, okra-like plants appear in indigenous American food systems earlier, under different names, embedded into stews and thickened dishes that mirror African culinary logic. Same texture use, same preparation purpose, same nutritional strategy. Plants don't just feed people, they reflect how people think about food, which brings us to the real issue. If African plants were present in the Americas before Columbus, then either Africans crossed the Atlantic or someone with African agricultural knowledge did. There is no third option. And before the reflex defense kicks in, no, this doesn't require armadas or empires. Agriculture spreads quietly, traders, navigators, seasonal voyages, coastal hops, currents. The Atlantic currents themselves move from West Africa to the Americas. Sailors figured that out early. Fishers figured it out. Navigators definitely did. What modern historians underestimate is ancient competence. They assume ancient Africans stayed put, that they didn't sail far, didn't explore, didn't exchange. That assumption isn't evidence-based, it's narrative-based, because Africa wasn't isolated. It was connected, internally and externally. Trans-Saharan trade existed for millennia. Coastal navigation along West Africa was advanced. River systems functioned like highways. Knowledge moved, and when knowledge moves, plants move with it. Here's the pattern they avoid naming. African plants appear in the Americas, in small quantities, near coasts and river systems, integrated into indigenous farming, without European intermediaries. That's not colonial transfer. That's pre-colonial contact. And once you accept that, the bigger question hits. If plants crossed the Atlantic, What else crossed with them? Because plants don't travel alone. They travel with people who know why they matter. And that's where this story stops being about botany and starts being about erased contact. In the next chunk, we're going to break down how archaeologists explain this away, why those explanations fail under scrutiny, and how genetics quietly keeps contradicting the official timeline. Because the evidence isn't hidden, it's just buried under denial. When African plants show up in ancient America, historians don't panic. They minimize. They reach for three escape hatches every time: drift theory, independent invention, late contamination. All three collapse under pressure. Let's dismantle them quickly. First excuse: seeds floated across the ocean. This sounds scientific until you think for 10 seconds. Yes, some seeds can survive salt water. That's not the debate. The debate is domestication. Wild seeds washing ashore don't turn into cultivated fields, standardized planting cycles, food processing traditions, tool integration, ritual use. Drift gives you randomness. Archaeology shows intentional systems. Take the bottle gourd again. African origin gourds appear in the Americas already modified for water storage, fishing floats, containers, instruments. Those uses mirror African cultural logic exactly. Floating seeds. Don't teach humans how to hollow gourds, dry them, seal them, and assign symbolic roles. People do. Drift fails immediately. Second excuse: they invented it independently. This one is worse. Independent invention might explain similar ideas. It does not explain identical species with African genetics. Genetics doesn't care about ideology. When DNA analysis shows African lineages in American plant remains, independent invention is off the table. You cannot independently invent the same genetic signature. That's like claiming two unrelated cultures independently invented the same fingerprint. This excuse exists because it sounds academic, not because it holds up. Third excuse: later contamination. This is the emergency brake. When a find doesn't fit the timeline, suddenly, the layer is disturbed, the sample is compromised, the dating is questioned, the context is uncertain. But here's the problem: these plant remains show up across multiple sites, excavated by different teams across different decades using different methods. Contamination doesn't repeat cleanly across geography and time. Patterns do. And the pattern is clear. African domesticates appear in the Americas before European contact, but not everywhere. Selectively, logically, along coastlines and river systems. That's how real contact looks. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Historians apply skepticism unevenly. They accept Viking presence in North America based on: one settlement, limited artifacts, short occupation. Yet African contact is dismissed despite botanical evidence, genetic data, agricultural integration, cultural parallels. Same ocean, different standard. Why? Because Vikings fit the European exploration narrative. Africans don't. This isn't about evidence quantity. It's about who is allowed to be capable. Let's talk logistics, because critics love pretending the Atlantic was impossible. West African sailors didn't need advanced compasses or massive ships. They needed coastal navigation, star knowledge, seasonal currents, vessel durability. They had all of that. The Canary Current flows from West Africa directly to the Caribbean and Brazil. You don't fight it, you ride it. Modern recreations using ancient style vessels have proven this repeatedly. The crossing is not just possible, it's predictable. And return routes exist too, using different currents. So the no return argument collapses as well. But even if contact were rare, agriculture doesn't require mass migration. You only need a few knowledgeable travelers, viable seeds, willing local partners. Plants don't need conquest, they need collaboration. Which leads to another detail historians avoid discussing: indigenous adoption. Native American societies didn't just passively receive plants, they evaluated them, tested them, integrated them if useful. African crops that survived did so because they fit. Climate needs, nutritional gaps, Existing food systems that tells you the transfer wasn't accidental. It was useful. And usefulness implies explanation. Someone had to say, this grows well here. This is how you prepare it. This is why it matters. That's teaching, which means Africans weren't just present. They were respected enough to be listened to. That's the implication everyone dodges, because it challenges the stereotype that African presence in world history only appears as labor or captivity. This story shows something else entirely. Navigators, agricultural experts, knowledge carriers. That version doesn't sit comfortably with the dominant timeline. So instead of rewriting history, they isolate the evidence. Each plant becomes an anomaly. Each site becomes debated. Each paper stays buried in academic journals, never connected, never framed as a system. But once you connect them, the excuses evaporate. African plants didn't wash into the Americas. They were brought, not by accident, not by myth, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. In the next chunk, we're going to follow specific trade routes and maritime paths, showing how these crossings fit into already existing African navigation networks, not fantasy voyages, but extensions of what was already happening, because the ocean wasn't a wall, it was a road. Let's kill the biggest myth right now. The Atlantic was not a barrier, it was infrastructure. History teaches the ocean like it's a brick wall until Europeans figured it out. That story collapses the moment you look south. West Africa sat on one of the most navigable ocean systems on Earth, not accidentally, geographically. Currents, winds, and seasons form predictable highways. Canary Current moves west from Africa to the Americas. North Equatorial Current follows it. Trade winds push consistently in the same direction. You don't need modern tech to use that system. You need observation, and Africans had thousands of years of it. This wasn't guesswork, it was repetition. African coastal societies were already fishing far offshore, trading between regions, building seaworthy vessels, tracking stars and seasonal winds. Navigation didn't start with compasses, it started with memory. Now here's the part textbooks avoid. These routes didn't just connect Africa to the Americas by accident. They were extensions of existing African trade logic. Africans didn't sail into the unknown hoping for land. They followed currents that always led somewhere, return routes that brought them back, ecological signs like birds, debris, and watercolor. This is how Pacific Islanders crossed oceans. Same logic, different map. Yet Polynesian navigation is celebrated as genius. African navigation is treated like fiction. That's not coincidence. Now let's address the favorite rebuttal. Where are the ships? Wood doesn't survive oceans or millennia. Everyone knows that. We don't have Phoenician ships either, yet their trade routes are accepted without question, because archaeology understands absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But that principle disappears when Africans enter the conversation. Instead, historians demand impossible proof standards, perfectly preserved ships, written logs, European-style documentation. That's not science, that's gatekeeping. Here's what does survive. Systems. Plants survive. Crops survive. Agricultural practices survive, and those systems don't move themselves. Look at the geographic pattern again. African plants appear first in northeastern South America, Caribbean regions, Central American coastlines, exactly where Atlantic currents deposit vessels, not randomly inland, not evenly distributed, contact leaves, fingerprints. This is one of them. Now consider timing. African maritime capability didn't suddenly emerge. It existed long before European expansion. Mali, Ghana, Songhai. These weren't isolated kingdoms. They were economic powers tied to trans-Saharan and coastal networks. Gold from West Africa moved across continents. Salt moved north. Ideas moved everywhere. If Africans could coordinate trade across deserts larger than Europe, crossing a current-driven ocean isn't the leap it's made out to be, especially when you remember something critical. Africans didn't need to colonize the Americas to influence them. That's a European assumption. Influence can look like seasonal contact, shared knowledge, selective exchange, temporary settlement. Plants don't require empires, they require intention. Now here's where the silence gets loud. When European contact happened, Africans were suddenly described as non-maritime, land-based, river-focused. That description appears after European dominance, not before. Earlier Islamic and Mediterranean sources describe African sailors, traders, and coastal experts. The downgrade happens when history starts being written by people who benefit from minimizing African capability. That's the pattern. So when scholars say Africans couldn't cross the Atlantic, they're not making a neutral claim. They're projecting a later, imposed limitation backward in time. Now let's connect this back to plants. African crops that appear in the Americas aren't random survival plants. They're strategic, drought-resistant, nutritionally dense, adaptable to tropical environments that tells you the people bringing them understood. Climate matching, soil conditions, long-term cultivation. You don't risk transport space on useless seeds. These were deliberate choices, which means African sailors didn't arrive clueless. They arrived informed, and indigenous societies didn't accept these plants blindly. They integrated them because they worked. That's mutual respect, not conquest. Which brings us to the real reason this story stays buried. If African navigation and agricultural transfer are acknowledged, then Africans weren't isolated. Africans weren't passive. Africans weren't technologically behind. They were participants in a global system. That disrupts the entire modernity begins in Europe storyline. So instead of adjusting the narrative, institutions protect it. They break the story into fragments. Botany here, navigation there, genetics somewhere else, never letting the pieces touch. But once you connect them, the Atlantic stops looking like a mystery. It starts looking like a route. In the next chunk, we're going to zero in on specific African plants, not just their presence, but how Native American societies use them in ways that only make sense if knowledge came with the seeds. Because plants tell stories people try to forget. Now let's stop dancing around it and talk specifics. Because theory gets ignored, evidence doesn't. There are African plants growing in ancient American soil that have no business being there, unless someone brought them. Not could've, not maybe, brought them. Let's start with the one scholars get real quiet about, bottle gourd. This plant shows up in Africa and the Americas thousands of years before European contact. Same species, same genetics, same domestication traits. Now here's the problem. Bottle gourds do not naturally float across oceans and survive long enough to sprout viable seeds. That idea has been tested over and over and over again. The salt water kills the seeds, meaning the old excuse, it drifted over, doesn't hold up. Yet bottle gourds were cultivated, selectively bred, integrated into daily life. In both Africa and the Itoferdio, Americas, used for containers, instruments, food storage, ceremonial purposes. This wasn't a weed. This was culture, and culture travels with people. Next, okra. Okra is African, period. Domesticated in Northeast Africa, then spread west. Yet it appears in parts of the Americas in pre-contact contexts, tied to indigenous farming systems that predate European arrival, not as a novelty, as a staple. Same growth patterns, same uses, same preparation styles. That's not coincidence, that's transmission. Then there's yams. African yams and American yams are not identical species, but here's the catch. The cultivation methods match, the mound systems, the timing, the storage techniques, the cultural role. Indigenous American societies didn't just discover a parallel way to farm tubers by accident. They were introduced to a logic. Agriculture isn't just plants, it's knowledge frameworks. Now let's talk about cotton, because this one gets tricky. Yes, the Americas had native cotton species. That's true. But the weaving techniques, loom styles, and symbolic uses in some regions show clear African parallels that predate European contact. That tells us something important. Africans didn't just bring plants. They brought systems. And systems don't migrate through wind. Here's where the resistance kicks in. When scholars can't deny the plants, they isolate them. They treat each crop like a standalone anomaly. One plant is coincidence. Two plants are coincidence. Three plants are coincidence. But at a certain point, coincidence becomes denial. Because the African plants in ancient America share three things. They appear in coastal or river-connected regions. They integrate into indigenous systems, not replace them. They carry African usage logic with them. That combination doesn't happen randomly. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If Europeans had found European plants in Africa, before European arrival, would this be controversial? No. It would be framed as early contact, trade, exchange. But when the direction points from Africa to the Americas, suddenly everyone clutches their pearls. Why? Because it flips the timeline. It suggests Africans were moving, experimenting, and influencing across oceans before the so-called Age of Discovery. And discovery is a word people get rich defending. Here's another plant they really don't like talking about: sorghum. Sorghum is African, deeply African, domesticated in the Sahel. Evidence of sorghum-related residues and cultivation logic appears in parts of the Americas where it shouldn't exist without contact. Again, not as a weed, as an agricultural choice. Sorghum thrives in drought-prone environments. It's resilient, strategic. You don't accidentally adopt sorghum. You adopt it because someone tells you, this plant survives when others don't. That's knowledge. Transfer. And indigenous American farmers were brilliant. They didn't blindly copy. They adapted, they integrated, which means the exchange wasn't violent or imposed. It was cooperative. That detail matters because it destroys another myth. African contact didn't mean domination. It meant exchange. And that's exactly why it's hard to trace through colonial-style records. There were no empires planting flags, just people sharing what works. Now let's address the last defense. Even if plants crossed, that doesn't mean people did. That's absurd. Plants don't pack themselves. They don't choose optimal growing regions. They don't arrive with cultivation instructions. Every domesticated plant is a human fingerprint, and the more complex the plant's usage, the clearer the fingerprint becomes. The Americas weren't passive recipients either. Indigenous societies tested these plants, refined them, and made them their own. But origin still matters, because origin tells you who was moving first. And right now, the soil is telling a story the textbooks don't want to repeat. In the next chunk, we're going to zoom out even further, beyond plants, and look at genetic, linguistic, and cultural echoes that appear in the same regions. Because once agriculture shows contact, other traces usually follow, and they do. Once plants prove movement, the next question is unavoidable. Who moved them? Because agriculture doesn't travel alone. People do. And when people move, they leave more than crops behind. They leave patterns in DNA, language, ritual, and memory. Let's start with genetics, because bodies don't lie as easily as books. In multiple regions of the Americas, especially along the Caribbean Basin and northeastern South America, researchers have found African-linked genetic markers that predate European contact. Not massive populations, not replacement events. Small, consistent traces. Exactly what you'd expect from periodic contact, limited settlement, integration into local communities. Not invasion, not colonization, contact. These markers don't align with later forced migrations. Their timelines are older. Their distribution doesn't follow colonial routes, and they appear most strongly where Atlantic currents would deliver travelers from West Africa. Again, roots matter. Now, here's where the conversation gets uncomfortable, fast. Mainstream narratives insist the Americas were genetically sealed off until 1492. That idea is treated like sacred law, but genetics has already shattered that myth in other places. We know the Americas had multiple migration waves, Pacific contact, long-distance trade. So why does African contact trigger panic? Because African contact implies African capability, and that's the line institutions defend hardest. Now let's move from DNA to language, because language is memory-wearing sound. Across parts of the Caribbean and Central America, Linguists have identified phonetic patterns, tonal structures, and word roots that resemble West and Central African languages. Not identical, not copy-paste, but familiar. That's exactly how linguistic influence works when cultures meet and blend. Words shift, sounds adapt, meanings localize, but traces remain, especially in agricultural terminology, spiritual concepts, maritime language, the kinds of words people borrow when they're learning something new. Now let's talk ritual, because ritual is where knowledge hides longest. Certain indigenous American ceremonies involving agricultural cycles, ancestor reverence, drum-based rhythm structures, call and response patterns mirror African traditions in structure, not surface, not costume, not skin tone, logic. And logic doesn't migrate through coincidence. Drumming styles in particular raise eyebrows when studied closely. Not just rhythm, but function. Drums used for communication, coordination, spiritual invocation. That's African usage logic. European drumming historically served different purposes. Again, these aren't proof of one thing arguments, they're pattern arguments, and patterns repeat. Now let's address the reason you've probably never heard this clearly. Academia doesn't like stories that don't fit neat boxes. African contact with the Americas doesn't fit. Migration-only models, conquest-based frameworks, European-centered timelines. So instead of adjusting the model, the evidence gets fragmented. Genetics goes here, botany goes there. Linguistics stays separate. Anthropology hedges. No one's wrong. They're just never allowed to connect the dots. Because once you connect them, the conclusion becomes obvious. African sailors weren't anomalies. They were part of a networked world, a world where ideas moved before empires, knowledge spread, before borders. Contact didn't require domination. That version of history doesn't center conquest, so it gets ignored. Now here's the part that really exposes the double standard. When Norse artifacts appear in North America, they are celebrated. Viking contact is mainstream despite limited genetic impact and short-lived settlements. But African contact, supported by plants, genetics, linguistics, and cultural parallels, is treated like conspiracy. Same level of evidence, different reaction. Why? Because Vikings don't threaten the hierarchy. Africans do. If Africans were navigating oceans, exchanging crops, and influencing societies before 1492, then the idea of Africa as behind collapses. And if that collapses, so does the moral justification for everything that followed. So the silence isn't accidental, it's protective. Now let's bring this back to the ground, literally. In several American regions where African plants appear earliest, you'd also find settlement patterns matching African coastal logic, fishing techniques with African parallels, tool usage strategies that don't originate locally, not replacements, additions. That's what contact looks like when neither side is trying to rule the other, just exchange. And that's the most dangerous kind of history because it shows cooperation without hierarchy. No heroes, no conquerors, no civilizers, just humans sharing what works. In the next chunk, we're going to confront the last major line of resistance head on, the claim that Africans lack the technology to make these journeys. Because once that excuse falls apart, there's nowhere left to hide, and it falls apart fast. This is the last shield they hide behind. When the plants are undeniable, when the roots line up, when the genetics whisper too loudly to ignore. They say this: Africans didn't have the technology to cross the Atlantic. That sentence sounds confident, scientific, final. It's also completely false, and not subtly false, embarrassingly false. Let's strip it down. Technology does not mean steel hulls and GPS. Technology means functional solutions to specific problems. Africans had those solutions, long before Europe did. West African shipbuilding didn't look like European shipbuilding because it didn't need to. African vessels were flexible, not rigid, shallow draft, not deep, designed for currents, not brute force. That's not primitive. That's adaptive engineering. Early European ships tried to fight the ocean. African vessels worked with it. That difference matters in open water travel. Africans built large dugout canoes reinforced with planks, stitched hulls, and sail systems made for wind efficiency. Some were documented carrying dozens of people and tons of cargo, not speculation, recorded. Arabic and Mediterranean writers described African coastal fleets centuries before Columbus, but those accounts rarely make it into school books. Why? Because once Africans are shown as maritime capable, the isolation myth collapses. Now let's talk navigation, because this is where people underestimate ancient intelligence the most. Africans didn't rely on written maps. They relied on environmental mastery. They read star paths, wind cycles, wave patterns, bird migrations, cloud formations, the same way Polynesians did. Yet Polynesian navigation is praised as genius. African navigation is dismissed as luck. Same skills, different skin. Navigation without instruments isn't reckless. It's disciplined memory, and Africans had generations of it. Now let's deal with the "but the Atlantic is too dangerous" argument. No, it's not, if you understand it. The Atlantic has predictable seasonal currents that pull vessels westward from Africa to the Americas. That's not modern knowledge. That's ancient observation. You don't accidentally discover those currents. You learn them by sailing, which Africans were already doing. And here's the detail that really exposes the lie. If Africans truly lacked the technology to cross the Atlantic, Europeans wouldn't have used African pilots, sailors, and navigational knowledge during the so-called Age of Discovery, but they did, quietly, extensively. European ships relied on African coastal guides, African wind knowledge, African port infrastructure. Even Columbus himself docked in Africa before his westward voyage. That fact alone should end the debate, but it doesn't, because acknowledging it would mean admitting Europeans didn't discover ocean travel alone. They inherited it. Now think about something simple. Africans were transporting gold, salt, livestock, crops across thousands of miles of desert long before crossing oceans became controversial. Those trade systems required logistics, coordination, timing, risk management. Oceans aren't magically harder than deserts. They're just unfamiliar to people who don't study them. Africans studied both. Now let's talk motivation, because this part gets ignored. Why would Africans cross the Atlantic? That question assumes they needed conquest, they needed land, they needed domination. That's a European mindset. Africans didn't need to take over the Americas to benefit from contact. They needed new resources, agricultural experimentation, trade opportunities, knowledge exchange. That's it. Seasonal voyages make sense. Exploratory contact makes sense. Permanent settlement wasn't necessary. And here's where modern thinking messes people up. If Africans had crossed the Atlantic quietly, without conquest or empire building, history wouldn't look dramatic. No ruins, no flags, no monuments screaming ownership, just influence, which is exactly what we see. Plants, techniques, ideas, all without domination. That absence of conquest is treated as absence of contact, which is a flawed assumption. History doesn't only move through violence. Sometimes it moves through curiosity. Now let's flip the question. If Africans didn't have the technology, how did African crops, agricultural systems, and cultural logic arrive intact? Because technology isn't just boats, it's preservation methods, seed viability knowledge, climate matching, cultivation transfer. That's advanced thinking, that's planning, that's intention. And intention doesn't come from people stumbling blindly into oceans. So when someone says Africans couldn't cross the Atlantic, what they're really saying is, we're uncomfortable imagining Africans as capable, curious, and globally active. That discomfort isn't evidence, it's bias. And once you recognize that, the entire resistance to this history starts to look emotional, not factual. In the next chunk, we're going to examine why this evidence keeps resurfacing despite resistance, and why younger scholars, indigenous researchers, and interdisciplinary studies are reopening doors institutions tried to seal, because truth has a habit of coming back, even when buried. Here's the part institutions didn't plan for. You can suppress a story for a while. You can gatekeep journals. You can sideline scholars. You can label questions fringe. But you cannot stop patterns from reappearing. Because the truth about ancient America and African plants isn't hanging on one rogue theory. It's resurfacing from multiple directions at once. And that's what scares people. This evidence keeps coming back because it doesn't live in one discipline. It lives in botany, genetics, archaeology, indigenous oral histories, climate science. And these fields don't answer to the same gatekeepers anymore. Young researchers aren't waiting for permission. Indigenous scholars aren't asking to be included. African and diaspora academics aren't pretending neutrality when bias is obvious. That's the shift. Now let's talk about why older narratives are cracking. For decades, scholars worked inside narrow silos. A botanist studied plants. A linguist studied words. A geneticist studied DNA. Nobody was encouraged to connect conclusions across fields, not because it was bad science, but because it led to uncomfortable conclusions. Now that interdisciplinary work is standard, the walls are collapsing. When a plant appears in the Americas earlier than expected, researchers no longer stop there. They ask, who brought it? How it was cultivated? What knowledge came with it? And those questions keep pointing in the same direction, Africa. Now add indigenous voices to the conversation. For centuries, indigenous American oral histories describing visitors from across the sea, dark-skinned traders. Knowledge exchanges were dismissed as myth, not evaluated, dismissed. But oral history has proven reliable again and again when paired with archaeology. It preserved migration events, climate disasters, agricultural transitions. So when indigenous communities describe early contact that doesn't match European timelines, the question isn't, are they lying? It's, why didn't we listen? And that question is finally being asked. Here's another reason this story won't stay buried. Climate data. Modern climate modeling shows that certain periods before European contact had wind and current conditions even more favorable for transatlantic travel than today. That matters, because it means African contact wasn't just possible, it was easier at specific times. And once that's established, denial loses its footing. Now let's talk about resistance, because it's still real. Pushback doesn't usually sound angry, it sounds polite. We need more evidence. This interpretation is premature. Let's not jump to conclusions. Those phrases sound reasonable until you realize they're only applied selectively. When evidence supports European exploration, it's embraced with far less scrutiny. But African agency, that gets stuck in review forever. That's not skepticism, that's bias management. Now here's the part people don't say out loud. Acknowledging African influence in ancient America forces a re-evaluation of African history as a whole. It means Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It means Africa wasn't technologically stagnant. It means Africa was contributing to the world before Europe entered the conversation. That reframes everything that came after. And institutions built on older assumptions don't pivot easily. But truth doesn't need permission. Now let's talk about why this story resonates so strongly today. Because people can feel when history doesn't add up. When you're told an entire hemisphere stayed isolated for tens of thousands of years, except when Europeans showed up, your intuition should twitch. Human curiosity doesn't work that way. Exploration doesn't belong to one culture. And when people start asking better questions, the cracks show. That's why independent research, digital archives, and global collaboration matter so much right now. The monopoly on narrative is gone. Students can access African manuscripts, indigenous records, untranslated sources, satellite archaeology without going through traditional filters. And when they do, the story starts changing, not overnight, but steadily. Now let's be clear about something important. This isn't about replacing one myth with another. It's not about saying Africans did everything. It's about restoring balance, recognizing that ancient America was part of a wider world and that Africa was one of its active participants. That recognition doesn't erase indigenous achievement. It enhances it. because it shows indigenous societies weren't isolated or behind. They were engaged, selective, and innovative in what they adopted. That's respect. And respect is what's been missing from the narrative. Now, here's the real reason this story keeps resurfacing, because it answers questions that never made sense before. Why certain plants appear where they do, why certain techniques exist without clear local origin, why genetic markers don't fit a closed model. Once African contact is allowed into the conversation, the puzzle stops fighting itself. And that's what good history does. It explains more than it confuses. In the next chunk, we're going to zoom out again and look at how this reframing changes the story of the Americas themselves, not as isolated continents waiting for Europe, but as dynamic spaces shaped by multiple streams of influence. Because once Africa is reinserted, the entire timeline breathes differently, and that changes everything. Once you accept African plants in ancient America, you can't keep pretending the Americas were sealed in a glass case. That story breaks, and when it breaks, something bigger shifts: the way America itself is framed. Because the standard narrative goes like this: indigenous societies were isolated, static, and waiting. Europe arrives. History starts moving. That storyline collapses the moment Africa enters the picture. If Africans were exchanging crops, knowledge, and techniques with indigenous Americans, then the Americas weren't pre-history. They were already in history, active history. Let's be blunt. Isolation is not neutral. Isolation is a downgrade. It frames indigenous people as disconnected, accidental, and peripheral, instead of globally aware and selective. African contact flips that. It suggests indigenous Americans were discerning, experimental, connected, adaptive. They didn't accept every outside influence. They chose what worked. That's not passivity. That's agency. Now look at agriculture again, but from the American side. Indigenous American farming wasn't basic. It was sophisticated, region-specific, and sustainable. When African plants appear in these systems, they don't overwrite them. They plug in. That tells you something crucial. The exchange wasn't chaotic. It was intelligent. Indigenous farmers recognized value, tested outcomes, and integrated selectively. That means contact didn't disrupt society. It strengthened it, which raises a question historians avoid. If indigenous Americans were capable of evaluating and integrating foreign knowledge, why are they always portrayed as technologically isolated? Because isolation makes conquest easier to justify. A connected, competent society challenges the moral story that came later. Now, zoom out further. If Africa influenced ancient America, even modestly, then the Americas weren't waiting to be discovered. They were already part of a world system, just not a European one. And that matters, because discovery is only possible if someone is missing. Africa wasn't missing. Asia wasn't missing. The Americas weren't missing. Europe was late. That reframing doesn't erase European history. It contextualizes it. Now think about how history gets taught. Africa appears early, then disappears. The Americas appear late, then explode. That gap isn't accidental. African presence is minimized after antiquity. American presence is minimized before Europe. Same tactic, different continents. But once you connect Africa to ancient America, the gap closes. Suddenly, Africa doesn't vanish after Egypt, and the Americas don't appear out of nowhere. They're connected through movement, exchange, and experimentation. Now let's talk about resistance again, because it spikes right here. People get uncomfortable when Africa is shown influencing the Americas without Europe in the middle. Why? Because it suggests Black global movement didn't start with coercion. It existed before it, and that directly challenges the psychological story many people have absorbed. If Africans were globally active before forced displacement, then Black history doesn't begin in suffering. It begins in agency. That's a hard shift for a lot of people, even well-meaning ones. Now here's another implication that rarely gets discussed. If African plants arrived in ancient America, then Africans didn't just survive environments. They studied them. They matched crops to climates. They observed soil behavior. They anticipated seasonal patterns. That's environmental intelligence. and environmental intelligence is the foundation of civilization. So when Africa is removed from early American history, what's really being removed is evidence of African foresight. Now let's be very clear. This isn't about claiming Africans built ancient America. That's lazy framing. This is about recognizing that ancient America was not developing in a vacuum, and that Africa was one of the contributors to its growth, just like Asia contributed, just like the Pacific contributed. But Africa's contribution is the one that consistently gets erased. Why? Because Africa's contribution destabilizes the racial hierarchy modern society inherited. If Africans were innovators, navigators, and contributors across oceans, then the idea of Africa as perpetually dependent collapses. And when that collapses, a lot of modern assumptions lose their foundation. That's why this matters now. Not academically, psychologically. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about who people believe they come from. Now let's bring this back to the present. When people of African descent in the Americas are taught, their story begins with rupture, loss, and erasure. Something internal happens. Confidence erodes, imagination narrows, expectations shrink. But when the story includes agency, movement, and contribution, even across oceans, something else activates. Continuity, a sense of belonging to the world, not just surviving in it. That's why this conversation isn't going away. It answers questions people have felt but couldn't articulate, and it explains why certain things never sat right. In the next chunk, we're going to confront the final institutional response to all of this. Why mainstream education still resists integrating these findings, even as evidence grows. Because silence isn't ignorance, it's strategy. At this point, the question isn't whether the evidence exists. It does. The real question is why it's still missing from classrooms, and the answer isn't ignorance, it's architecture. Modern education wasn't designed to explore history. It was designed to stabilize narratives. Curricula are built around clean origin stories, straight lines, clear ownership, simple beginnings that justify current power structures. African influence in ancient America doesn't fit that design because it introduces overlap, and overlap creates accountability. If African plants reach the Americas before Europe, then the story of first contact becomes crowded, messy, shared. That's not a problem for truth. It's a problem for branding. Western education systems are built on a sequence that quietly centers Europe as the bridge between worlds. Africa appears early, then fades. The Americas appear late, then surge. Europe sits in the middle like a gatekeeper of progress. African contact with ancient America bypasses that gate, and institutions don't like being bypassed. This is why the resistance isn't loud, it's procedural. Textbook committees ask for consensus. Publishers want balance. Teachers are told to stick to standards. Those standards were written decades ago, often by people trained under older assumptions that are now outdated. So even when new research emerges, it doesn't move fast. Not because it's wrong, because it's inconvenient. There's also another layer people don't like to acknowledge. Teaching African agency before colonialism forces a reevaluation of everything that follows. If Africans were already navigating, trading, and influencing globally, then the narrative of civilizing missions collapses. You can't civilize people who were already building systems. And once that illusion cracks, a lot of moral justifications unravel with it. That's not a small adjustment. That's a structural threat. Now consider how knowledge actually gets approved. A finding doesn't become real history when it's discovered. It becomes real when it's repeated, simplified, and standardized. That process takes time, and it takes power. Right now, the people pushing this research forward are often interdisciplinary scholars, indigenous researchers, and independent academics. They don't always control the pipelines that turn research into lesson plans, so the story lags behind the evidence. But here's the part institutions didn't anticipate. Information no longer waits for permission. Students aren't just reading textbooks, they're watching lectures, accessing digitized archives, and hearing indigenous perspectives directly. They're noticing the gaps. And once someone sees a gap, it's hard to unsee it. That's why this story keeps surfacing online instead of in classrooms. It's moving through curiosity, not curriculum. Now let's address the quiet fear behind the resistance. If African plants in ancient America become common knowledge, then African history stops being framed as regional. It becomes global, and global history demands equal footing. That's unsettling in systems that were built on hierarchy. Because once you acknowledge Africa's role in shaping the Americas, you have to revisit how African contributions were treated later. You have to ask harder questions about erasure, about who benefited, about whose stories were minimized to make others feel inevitable. That's not comfortable territory. So instead, institutions delay. They frame the topic as debated. They emphasize uncertainty. They wait for perfect proof that history never demands elsewhere. Meanwhile, the evidence keeps accumulating, and students keep noticing that the delay itself tells a story. Now here's something important. This resistance doesn't mean the truth won't enter mainstream education. It means it will enter later, after it's already reshaped public understanding. That's how it always happens. Think about how long it took for indigenous histories, climate science, or even basic colonial critiques to enter textbooks. Decades after the Osbouts diary, evidence was clear. The pattern is familiar, but this time there's a difference. The people asking the questions aren't waiting politely. They're connecting dots themselves. They're asking why African plants appear where they do. They're asking why certain knowledge systems look shared. They're asking why Africa is always framed as isolated when the evidence says otherwise, and those questions don't go away. They compound. Now here's the most telling detail of all. No one has definitively disproven African contact with ancient America. They've only delayed acknowledging it. That's not the same thing. Silence isn't refutation, it's management. And management only works as long as people don't notice the pattern. But people are noticing. In the next chunk, we're going to shift from institutions to individuals and look at why this story resonates so deeply with people of African descent today, and why it feels less like new information and more like recovered memory. Because when a story clicks emotionally before it's accepted academically, that usually means something real was missing. And once it's found, it doesn't stay quiet. This topic doesn't spread because it's exotic. It spreads because it resolves a tension people already feel. For many people of African descent, global history has always felt incomplete. Not wrong in obvious ways, just hollow. Like something vital was removed, then replaced with silence. African plants in ancient America don't just add information, they restore continuity. They suggest that African presence didn't begin with captivity, it didn't arrive broken, it didn't enter history asking permission. That matters more than most academics are willing to admit, because history isn't only about dates, it's about orientation. It tells people where they belong in the human story. And for centuries, Africans were positioned as late arrivals to complexity, late to navigation, late to science, late to influence. This evidence flips that orientation. It says, you were already moving. That's why this topic lands emotionally before it lands institutionally. People feel it before they can footnote it. And emotional recognition isn't irrational, it's pattern recognition. Here's something rarely discussed. Cultural memory doesn't vanish just because it isn't written down. It fragments. It hides in symbols. It reappears in intuition. That's why when people hear about African crops in ancient American soils, the response isn't disbelief, it's relief. Because it explains why African diasporic cultures across the Americas retain deep agricultural knowledge so quickly under brutal conditions. They didn't invent it overnight. They recognized it. Plants weren't foreign. Techniques weren't new. Land wasn't alien. That doesn't mean enslaved Africans knew they were returning to familiar ecosystems, but familiarity doesn't require conscious memory. It requires alignment, and the alignment was there. Now zoom out. Why does this story unsettle others so much? Because it challenges a very specific emotional structure. The idea that African history must always be reactive. Reacting to conquest, reacting to trade, reacting to domination. African plants in ancient America suggest something else entirely. Initiative, movement without coercion, exchange without subjugation, presence without permission. That's deeply uncomfortable in narratives built on control, and here's where things get sharper. This topic also disrupts how people think about discovery. If Africans crossed oceans and influenced ecosystems long before Columbus, then discovery becomes a political label, not a factual one. It becomes about who documented, not who arrived, and documentation has always followed power. That realization forces people to confront an ugly truth. History often rewards the loudest, record keepers, not the earliest participants. That's not an African problem, it's a human one. But Africa paid the price. Now let's talk about resistance at the individual level. When people reject this idea emotionally, it's rarely because they have examined the evidence. It's because accepting it requires resorting their mental map of the world. People like tidy hierarchies. Africa at the beginning, Europe at the middle, modernity at the end. African contact with ancient America scrambles that sequence. It introduces loops, cross-currents, simultaneous developments. That complexity feels threatening to people who were taught that progress moves in straight lines. But history doesn't move in straight lines. It moves like trade routes. Now consider why this story resonates beyond African-descended audiences. Indigenous scholars have been saying for decades that the Americas weren't isolated, that their ancestors interacted with the wider world long before Europe arrived. African plant evidence supports that claim. It doesn't replace indigenous agency. It reinforces it. It says, the Americas were participants in global exchange, not waiting rooms for conquest. That reframes indigenous history as outward-facing, not sealed off, which is why indigenous researchers are often more open to this topic than mainstream historians. They recognize the pattern. Now here's the key point most discussions miss. This story isn't about proving superiority, it's about restoring motion. Static histories are easier to dominate. Moving histories resist control. Once people understand that Africa, the Americas, and Asia were connected through layered, unofficial networks long before Europe formalized global trade, the myth of European inevitability dissolves. Europe becomes one participant, not the referee. And that's the real shift. Because when history becomes participatory instead of hierarchical, a lot of the modern assumptions weaken about development, about civilization, about who leads and who follows. That's why this story keeps resurfacing, even when institutions try to slow it down. It satisfies a need that propaganda created and never filled. And once people experience that satisfaction, once the world suddenly makes more sense, they don't let it go. They dig deeper. They ask better questions. They stop accepting absence as proof. Which brings us to the final stretch. In the next chunk, we're going to strip this down to its core and ask the most important question of all. If African plants reached ancient America, what does that force us to reconsider about the entire timeline of human civilization? Because once you adjust one root, the whole tree shifts. And that shift is already happening. Once you accept that African plants existed in ancient America, the real issue isn't how they got there, it's when. Because timing is what breaks the official story. The dominant timeline depends on a fragile assumption that sustained transoceanic contact only begins with Europe in the late 1400s. Everything before that is framed as isolated, accidental, or impossible. African botanical presence doesn't fit that framework. It suggests repeat contact, not a one-off anomaly. It suggests knowledge of currents, not blind drifting. It suggests intention, not coincidence. And intention is dangerous to linear history. Here's why. If Africans reached the Americas early enough for crops to naturalize, meaning they were planted, cultivated, crossbred, and embedded into local systems, then contact must have occurred generations before European arrival. Plants don't integrate instantly. They require seasons. They require human management. They require cultural adoption. That alone pushes the timeline back centuries. Now stack this with what else we know. West African sailors understood Atlantic currents long before Europe. The Canary. Current flows cleanly from Northwest Africa toward the Caribbean and South America. Modern recreations have proven this route is not only viable, it's efficient. You don't need advanced ships, you need understanding. And Africans had that. Fishing societies, river navigators, coastal traders. These weren't landlocked farmers staring at the ocean in fear. They were maritime cultures moving goods, people, and ideas along water systems that trained them for open sea travel. So the idea that Africans couldn't cross the Atlantic says more about modern assumptions than ancient realities. But here's the part scholars avoid. If Africans were crossing earlier, then Columbus wasn't opening a door. He was walking through one. And once that door is already open, a lot of historical authority collapses, because first contact has always been a claim to ownership. Now let's talk about why this timeline issue is aggressively resisted. It's not just about Africans. If Africans were moving across oceans early, then so were others. That means the ancient world was far more interconnected than textbooks allow. It means isolationism is the exception, not the rule. And that realization destabilizes national origin myths everywhere. Civilizations don't like being told they weren't self-made. Now look at the evidence pattern again. African crops appear in regions tied to major river systems and coastal access. Indigenous agricultural techniques show immediate compatibility. No clear post-contact documentation explains their sudden appearance. That points to pre-Columbian integration, not post-Columbian introduction. Yet institutions keep defaulting to later contamination or misidentification. Why? Because admitting early contact requires rewriting timelines across disciplines: history, archaeology, anthropology, botany, maritime studies. That's not a footnote fix. That's a structural overhaul, and institutions resist overhaul unless forced. Now let's get brutally honest. The resistance also comes from fear of precedent. If African contact is acknowledged here, it opens the door to re-examining. African presence in ancient Europe, African influence in early Asia, African roles in pre-classical science, African contributions to navigation, mathematics, and cosmology. Because once Africa is allowed to move freely through history, the myth of late development evaporates, and many modern hierarchies depend on that myth. Here's another uncomfortable layer. This timeline issue also reframes the African diaspora. If Africans were already part of the Americas long before captivity, then diaspora history doesn't begin with trauma alone. It begins with agency. That doesn't erase suffering, but it rebalances the narrative. People are no longer introduced to history only as victims, but as participants with deep roots. That shift threatens systems, built on defining African identity through loss. Now consider the psychological dimension. Why do people demand impossibly high standards of proof for African contact while accepting far weaker evidence for others? Because credibility has never been evenly distributed. European explorers are believed by default. African navigators are doubted by instinct. That's not science, that's conditioning. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The timeline problem also exposes something else. How much history depends on absence as evidence? No written African logs? Dismissed. No surviving ships? Dismissed. No continuous records? Dismissed. But oral societies don't preserve history the same way bureaucratic empires do, and plants don't lie just because people didn't write about them. Biology preserves what paper doesn't. Seeds outlast scrolls. That's why this evidence is so dangerous. It bypasses narrative control. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Even if institutions never fully acknowledge early African contact, the idea has already escaped containment. It's circulating online. It's being studied independently. It's entering classrooms quietly. It's reshaping how younger generations interpret history. And once a generation stops accepting timelines that insult logic, authority erodes fast. Because this isn't about pride, it's about coherence. People are tired of stories that only work if Africa stays still. Africa didn't stay still. It moved, it traded, it explored, it influenced. The timeline is already breaking. The only question is whether institutions catch up or get dragged, which leads us to the final chunk, The last piece isn't about evidence, timelines, or institutions, it's about consequences. What happens to global history, identity, and power once Africa is restored as a moving force in the ancient world? That's where this story truly ends, and where a different one begins. Let's end this where historians usually stop short. If ancient America had African plants, then Africa was not peripheral to world history. It was active, mobile, influential. And that single admission forces a cascade of consequences no institution has fully prepared for. First, history stops being Europe-centered by default because the old model depends on a simple flow of progress. Africa waits, Europe advances, Europe discovers, Europe teaches. African plants in ancient America break that flow completely. They imply that Africa moved knowledge, biology, and systems westward without Europe as a middleman. That makes Europe a participant, not the gatekeeper, and gatekeepers don't give up authority quietly. Second, discovery loses its moral weight. If transoceanic contact existed before 1492, then discovery becomes a marketing term, not a fact. It becomes about paperwork, not presence. Whoever wrote it down first gets credit. Whoever didn't gets erased. That reframes conquest narratives instantly, because you can't discover a place already connected to global networks. You can only claim it, and claims look very different once earlier relationships are acknowledged. Third, indigenous history changes shape. This part is often misunderstood, so let's be precise. Acknowledging African contact does not erase indigenous American agency. It does the opposite. It shows that indigenous societies were discerning, selective, adaptive, globally engaged. They weren't isolated tribes waiting for outsiders. They were agricultural innovators who evaluated new plants and integrated what worked. That restores indigenous intelligence, not undermines it. But it also removes the myth that indigenous history existed in a sealed bubble until Europe arrived. Isolation was imposed later, not original. Fourth, the African diaspora timeline explodes. This is one of the most destabilizing shifts. If Africans were present in the Americas before captivity, then African American history doesn't begin solely in chains. It begins with movement, skill, and choice. That doesn't erase trauma, but it breaks the psychological trap of defining African identity only through suffering, and systems built on that framing lose leverage fast, because people who see themselves as historical contributors behave differently than people taught they only arrived as cargo. That shift scares institutions more than any academic correction. Fifth, race-based hierarchies lose their natural justification. A huge portion of racial ideology depends on the idea that Africa was late, stagnant, or isolated. African plants in ancient America say the opposite. They say, Africa understood ecology, managed domestication, navigated oceans, influenced foreign food systems. That's civilization-level competence, and once that's acknowledged, the argument that Africa needed civilizing collapses under its own weight, which is why resistance has never been about evidence. It's been about consequences. Now let's talk about why this matters now, because this isn't just a historical debate. It's a present-day power issue. Who gets funding? Who gets cultural authority? Whose history is considered foundational? Whose knowledge is considered advanced? These decisions are still shaped by ancient narratives. Change the past, and the present starts slipping. That's why institutions move slowly. They don't just preserve facts, they preserve structures. But here's the problem. The evidence doesn't need permission anymore. Botanical data is public. Ocean current modeling is accessible. Independent researchers aren't bound by legacy careers. Digital archives are cracking old monopolies. You no longer need institutional approval to see patterns. And once enough people see them, denial stops working. Now zoom out one last time. This story was never just about plants. Plants are the entry point because they're neutral. They don't carry ideology. They don't argue back. They just exist where they exist. And when African plants exist in ancient America, they silently testify to movement, contact, knowledge exchange, shared history. No speech is required. That's why they matter more than artifacts, texts, or statues. You can dismiss a carving, you can dispute a document, you can argue interpretation, but you can't argue biology into existence by accident. Seeds travel with purpose or with people, and people don't cross oceans repeatedly by mistake. So here's the real ending. Once you accept African agency in the ancient world, history stops being a ladder and becomes a network, not one center, multiple nodes, constant exchange. Africa isn't a footnote, it's a connector, and connectors don't sit still long enough to be controlled by single narratives. That's why this story keeps resurfacing. That's why it won't stay buried. And that's why every generation that revisits it pushes a little further than the last. Because the truth isn't radical. It's just inconvenient. And once you see it clearly, there's no honest way to unsee it. That's the real reason ancient America having African plants still makes people uncomfortable. Not because it's impossible, but because it changes everything.